My daughter said I wasn't invited to my grandson's wedding. She said everyone insisted. So I'm Frances Henderson, 67 years young and retired after 30 years as a school principal. My grandson, Kyle, has been the light of my life since the day he was born. We've shared everything from fishing trips to late-night heart-to-hearts about his future. So when my daughter Jessica told me I wasn't invited to Kyle's wedding because everyone insisted, something inside me broke. Then she casually mentioned they were counting on the trust fund I control to pay for their extravagant plans. I said, understood, but quietly made different arrangements. Before I tell you what happened next, let me know where you're watching from and hit that subscribe button if you've ever had to stand up for yourself in your own family. Growing up in Milwaukee, I never imagined the twists my family story would take. After my husband George died when our daughter Jessica was only 7, I devoted myself to 2 things: my career as a school principal and raising our daughter right. We weren't wealthy, but we had enough. I worked hard, saved carefully, and made sure Jessica had everything she needed. When Jessica gave birth to Kyle at 23, I fell in love with my grandson instantly. Those early years were magical. I would babysit him 3 times a week while Jessica finished college. Kyle and I developed a special bond that I thought would last forever. I taught him to read before kindergarten, cheered at every Little League game, and was the one he called first when he got his college acceptance letter. I helped financially whenever I could. When Kyle needed braces, I paid for them. His first car at 16 was my gift, and I contributed significantly to his college fund, not because I had to, but because I wanted to invest in his future. Everything changed when Jessica married Richard Westbrook when Kyle was 7. At first, Richard seemed perfect, successful, charming, and he appeared to genuinely care about Jessica and Kyle. But as years passed, I noticed subtle changes in our family dynamic. Richard came from old money, the kind that's been in Boston for generations. His family owned banking interests, real estate developments, and had names on university buildings. Next to them, my career in public education seemed quaint and unimpressive. At first, they were polite to me, but their condescension was thinly veiled. As Kyle grew up, Richard's influence became more apparent. Summer camps became exclusive retreats that looked good on college applications. Public school was replaced with an expensive private academy. When Kyle visited me, Richard would call multiple times always, with some reason why Kyle needed to cut his visit short. Jessica gradually transformed too. My daughter, who once proudly introduced me to her friends, began making excuses for my ordinary background. She corrected my table manners at family gatherings and interrupted my stories. I watched her morph from the loving daughter I raised into someone who seemed embarrassed by my existence. When Kyle turned 18, I noticed he'd picked up some of Richard's mannerisms and attitudes. He was still sweet to me, but there was a new distance between us. He'd check his phone while I was talking or make comments about my outdated furniture. Small things, but they stung. Then Kyle met Sophia at the Westbrook family's country club during his junior year of college. She came from a background similar to Richard's, wealthy, connected, and accustomed to privilege. Her parents, the Montgomerys, owned a chain of luxury hotels. From our first meeting, I could tell they viewed me as an unfortunate footnote in Kyle's lineage. What Jessica and Richard didn't discuss much was the trust fund. When Kyle was born, George and I had established a modest trust for him with the life insurance money after George passed. Nothing extravagant, about $200,000 that had grown to nearly $500,000 over the years. I was the sole trustee until Kyle turned 30, with discretion over disbursements for education, health, and major life events. It wasn't meant to finance luxury, but to provide security and opportunity. As the years passed, I noticed Richard and Jessica referring to Kyle's trust as if it were a blank check. They began making suggestions about using it for a semester abroad at an exclusive Swiss university, then for a luxury car as a graduation present. I approved the study abroad, but suggested a reliable used car instead of the BMW they wanted. This caused tension, but I stood firm. The trust was for Kyle's benefit, not for maintaining appearances. By the time Kyle graduated college and began working at a financial firm where Richard had connections, the distance between us had grown. Our weekly calls became monthly, then occasional. Still, I treasured every moment with him and hoped that as he matured, he'd reconnect with the values I'd tried to instill. I never imagined that the wedding would become the breaking point, but looking back, all the warning signs were there. I just didn't want to see them. It was a Tuesday afternoon in April when Jessica came to my house unannounced. I remember thinking she looked uncomfortable as she sat stiffly on my living room sofa, the one she'd grown up curling up on with books and hot chocolate. "Mum, I need to talk to you about Kyle's wedding," she began, not quite meeting my eyes. "The thing is, the venue has strict capacity limits, and with all the family obligations and Richard's business connections, I knew what was coming before she said it. My heart started to pound in my chest, but I kept my expression neutral. They've had to make some difficult decisions about the guest list. Jessica continued her words, coming faster now. And given the circumstances and family politics involved, you won't be receiving an invitation. Though I'd sensed it coming, hearing the words felt like a physical blow. I sat very still, my hands folded in my lap to hide their slight tremor. "Family politics," I repeated quietly. "I'm his grandmother, Jessica." She shifted uncomfortably. "I know, Mum, it's complicated. Sophia's parents are very traditional about these things. They've invited over 100 of their friends and business associates. Richard's parents will be there, of course, and all his family. The Westbrooks have certain expectations for these events." "I see," I said, though I didn't. "So I'm the only grandparent who won't be there." Jessica had the grace to look embarrassed. "It's not just about numbers. Sophia's parents are concerned about appearances. They've planned an extremely formal affair at the Montgomery estate. Everything has to be perfect, and I wouldn't fit into their perfect picture," I finished for her. "Mum, please don't make this harder," Jessica sighed. "It's not personal, it's just how these families operate. You know, you've never really blended with Richard's crowd." I felt a flash of anger but pushed it down. "I never tried to blend, Jessica. I was too busy raising you by myself and working full-time." She flinched. "That's exactly the kind of comment that makes things uncomfortable. Can you understand that this is Kyle's big day? It's not about you." I took a deep breath. "I understand it's not about me. It's about Kyle, my grandson, whom I've loved since the day he was born. The grandson whose education I helped fund, whose first car I bought, who spent every summer with me until he was 15. Jessica glanced at her watch. "Speaking of the wedding costs, that's another thing I wanted to discuss. You know, Kyle will need access to his trust fund for the wedding expenses. They've planned quite an extensive honeymoon as well, 3 weeks in the Maldives and then Paris. Richard and I are handling the rehearsal dinner, but with everything else..." And there it was. I wasn't good enough to attend, but my money was welcome. Something cold settled in my stomach. "The trust," I said flatly. "Yes, they'll need the disbursement soon. The final payments for the venue are due next month, and the honeymoon needs to be fully paid by then too." I looked at my daughter, really looked at her. When had she become this person? When had money and status become more important than basic decency? "I understand," I said simply. Jessica looked relieved. She clearly had expected more resistance. "I knew you'd be reasonable, Mum. It's for Kyle's happiness after all." She left shortly after, with a quick, awkward hug and promises to send photos. As soon as the door closed behind her, I sank onto the sofa and let the tears come. The pain was sharp and deep, not just from being excluded, but from the realization that I'd become an embarrassment to my own family. Later that evening, I found myself in Kyle's old room, where I kept photo albums and memorabilia. I traced his smiling face in a picture from his high school graduation, my arm around his shoulders. Another showed us fishing at the lake house when he was 10, proudly holding up his first catch. So many memories, so much love, reduced to an inconvenience for his wedding day. As I put the albums away, my hand brushed against the folder containing the trust documents. I pulled it out and began to read an idea forming in my mind. I wasn't vindictive by nature, but perhaps it was time to teach my family a lesson about values. The terms were clear. I had full discretion as trustee until Kyle turned 30. While the money was his, the timing and purpose of disbursements were entirely my decision. I couldn't cancel the trust, but I could certainly freeze it temporarily. I closed the folder, my decision made. If I wasn't family enough to attend the wedding, then perhaps I wasn't family enough to finance it either. The next morning, I called Martin Goldstein, my attorney for over 20 years. He'd helped set up Kyle's trust and had been a friend of George's from college days. "Francis, what can I do for you today?" he asked warmly when we met at his downtown office. "I need to discuss Kyle's trust," I said. "Specifically, I want to understand exactly what control I have as trustee." Martin adjusted his glasses. "Well, as you know, you have complete discretion over disbursements until Kyle turns 30. The trust specifies that funds can be used for education, healthcare, and significant life events, but you determine what qualifies and when money is released. And if I decide to temporarily freeze disbursements," Martin looked surprised. "You have that right, certainly. May I ask what's prompting this? Is Kyle in some kind of trouble?" I explained the situation with the wedding invitation and how they still expected trust money to fund their extravagant plans. As I spoke, Martin's expression grew increasingly troubled. "I see," he said when I finished. "Legally, you're on solid ground if you want to delay disbursements. The trust was created for Kyle's benefit, not for social climbing or appeasing in-laws." He pulled out the trust documents and showed me the relevant sections. "Your late husband was quite clear about the purpose of this money. It states here that disbursements should support Kyle's growth, education, health, and well-being, but not indulge wasteful or frivolous expenditures." Hearing George's words gave me strength. He had been practical, down to earth, and deeply committed to raising children with strong values. What would he think of this situation? "There's something else I'd like you to look into," I said. "I want to know more about Sophia's family's financial situation. Just a basic background check." Martin raised an eyebrow. "That's not typically my area, but I have colleagues who can help discreetly. May I ask why?" "Just a hunch," I replied. "Something doesn't add up about this whole affair." A week later, Martin called me with his findings. The Montgomerys, despite their grand appearance and social standing, were not as financially secure as they appeared. Their hotel chain had been struggling for years, with 2 properties sold off to cover debts. They maintained their lifestyle largely through careful image management and strategic borrowing. This information crystallized my decision. The extravagant wedding wasn't just about social status. It was a financial performance they couldn't actually afford, and they expected Kyle's trust fund to help underwrite their charade. I called my bank and instructed them to place a temporary hold on the trust account. No disbursements would be processed until further notice. I didn't announce this move to Jessica or Kyle. I simply waited. That evening, I found an old letter George had written to be given to Kyle on his 18th birthday. I'd shared parts of it with him, but not the entire contents. In it, George wrote about the true meaning of wealth. Not as money or possessions, but as relationships' integrity and the ability to stand up for what's right. He ended with, "Money can buy comfort, but not character. That you must build yourself one decision at a time." I ran my fingers over George's handwriting, feeling his presence beside me. "I'm doing the right thing, aren't I?" I whispered to the empty room. The familiar ache of missing him swelled, then subsided into resolve. I was protecting not just my dignity, but Kyle's future character. Sometimes love means standing firm when it would be easier to give in. The next day, I drafted a simple letter to Kyle, not mentioning the trust or the wedding directly, but expressing my enduring love and hopes for his happiness. I told him about rediscovering his grandfather's letter and included a copy. Then I waited, knowing the storm would break soon enough. I didn't have to wait long. 3 days later, my phone rang. Jessica's name flashed on the screen. "Mum," she said without preamble, her voice tight with panic. "There's a problem with Kyle's trust. The wedding venue is saying they haven't received payment, and when Kyle contacted the bank, they said the account is frozen. Do you know anything about this?" "Yes," I said calmly. "I've temporarily suspended disbursements from the trust." The silence on the other end lasted several seconds. "You what?" Jessica finally managed, her voice rising. "You can't do that." "Actually, I can. I'm the trustee until Kyle turns 30. But why would you—" "This is about the wedding invitation, isn't it, Mum? That's incredibly petty." "It's not about pettiness, Jessica. It's about values and respect. If I'm not family enough to attend Kyle's wedding, then perhaps I shouldn't be financing it either." I heard her intake of breath. "Richard needs to hear this. We're coming over." Before I could respond, she hung up. I spent the next hour preparing myself mentally for the confrontation to come. When the doorbell rang, I took a deep breath and opened it to find not just Jessica, but Richard as well, both of them looking furious. Richard didn't even wait to be invited inside before he started. "What kind of game do you think you're playing, Francis?" he demanded, brushing past me into the living room. His tall frame seemed to fill the space with angry energy. "No game, Richard," I replied calmly, closing the door. "Please, both of you sit down." Jessica sank onto the sofa, but Richard remained standing, his expensive suit and perfect haircut contrasting sharply with my modest living room. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" he continued. "The venue is threatening to cancel if they don't receive payment by Friday. The caterers, the band, everything is at risk." "I'm aware that freezing the trust would cause complications," I said, taking a seat across from them. "That was intentional." Jessica's eyes filled with tears. "How could you do this to Kyle? It's supposed to be the happiest day of his life, and you're ruining it because your feelings got hurt." I felt a flash of anger but kept my voice level. "This isn't about hurt feelings, Jessica. It's about respect and family values. You've excluded me from a significant family event while still expecting me to fund it. That sends a very clear message about where I stand." Richard's face flushed. "The guest list isn't your concern. The Montgomerys have a certain standing to maintain. This wedding is important for Kyle's future connections." "Connections," I repeated. "More important than family." "You don't understand how these circles work," Richard said dismissively. "There are expectations, traditions." "I understand perfectly," I replied. "I'm just not willing to finance those expectations while being treated as an embarrassment." Jessica wiped her eyes. "Mum, please. This is going to devastate Kyle. Can't you think about him?" "I am thinking about him. I'm thinking about the values he's learning from this situation. What kind of lesson is it to exclude his grandmother but take her money?" Richard's expression hardened. "You do realize we can challenge this legally. The trust is for Kyle's benefit, and a wedding clearly qualifies." I nodded. "You're welcome to try, Richard. Martin assures me I'm within my rights as trustee. A court battle would take months long past the wedding date. Is that really what you want?" I saw the calculation in his eyes as he realized I had the upper hand. "What do you want, Francis?" he asked finally. "Just say it." "It's quite simple. I want to be invited to my grandson's wedding, not tucked away in some back corner, but acknowledged as his grandmother. Once I receive a proper invitation, the trust will be unfrozen." Jessica looked up. "That's it. Just an invitation. That's it." Richard and Jessica exchanged glances. "We'll have to discuss this with the Montgomerys," Richard said stiffly. "And with Kyle." "Of course," I replied. "Take all the time you need. The trust will be there when you decide family is important." After they left, I wondered why Kyle himself hadn't been part of this confrontation. In all the anger and accusations, he'd been notably absent. Had they even told him what was happening, or was he being manipulated? just as they'd tried to manipulate me. Over the next few days, I received several more calls from Jessica, each progressively less hostile and more pleading. She tried different tactics: guilt, nostalgia, even flattery, but I remained firm. Richard called once with veiled legal threats, which I calmly referred to Martin. What troubled me was Kyle's silence. Surely he knew what was happening by now. Did he agree with his parents' decision to exclude me? Had he become so enmeshed in their world that he saw nothing wrong with this situation? A week passed with no resolution. I went about my daily routines: book club on Wednesday, volunteer work at the literacy centre on Thursdays, lunch with my retired colleagues on Friday. But always the situation with Kyle weighed on my mind. Then, 10 days after my confrontation with Jessica and Richard, my doorbell rang on a Sunday afternoon. When I opened it, I found Kyle standing there alone, looking uncertain and much younger than his 25 years. "Grandma," he said simply, "can we talk?" Kyle stood awkwardly on my doorstep, hands shoved in his pockets, like he used to do as a teenager when he was nervous. He'd lost weight since I'd last seen him at Christmas, and there were shadows under his eyes. "Of course we can talk," I said, stepping aside to let him in. "Would you like some tea? I just made a fresh pot." He nodded, following me to the kitchen, where so many of our important conversations had taken place over the years. As I poured the tea, I noticed his hands trembling slightly when he took the mug. "Mum and Richard told me what happened," he began hesitantly, "about the trust and everything else." I sat down across from him. "I'm sure they did. I'd like to hear your perspective, though." He stared into his tea. "Honestly, Grandma, this whole wedding has become something I barely recognise. It started as just Sophia and me wanting to get married and somehow turned into this enormous production with hundreds of people I've never even met. This wasn't what I'd expected to hear. You didn't want a big wedding. Not like this." He shook his head. "Sophia and I talked about something smaller, maybe at that little chapel near the lake where we first went sailing. But her parents insisted on hosting at their estate. Then Richard got involved, and suddenly there were discussions about which business associates needed to be invited and how it would look if certain people weren't included." "And how did I end up on the not included list?" I asked gently. Kyle's face flushed with shame. "That's why I'm here, Grandma. I need to apologise. I didn't know you weren't invited until last week when the trust issue came up. Sophia's mother had taken over the guest list working with Mum. They told me everything was handled and I just needed to focus on my job and the honeymoon plans." I felt a wave of relief. At least Kyle hadn't been part of the decision to exclude me. "So you didn't know?" "No, I would never have agreed to that. When I found out, I confronted Mum and Richard. They gave me all these explanations about venue capacity and how you might feel uncomfortable with the formality. But then Richard slipped and mentioned something about maintaining appearances for Sophia's parents." Kyle ran a hand through his hair in frustration. I realised then that they were more concerned about impressing the Montgomerys than including my own grandmother. I was furious. "What did Sophia say?" I asked, curious about my future granddaughter-in-law's role in all this. "That's another thing," Kyle said, looking up with more animation. "When I told her what happened, she was horrified. She'd been told you declined the invitation because you don't like formal events. She's been wondering why I wasn't more upset about it." I couldn't help but smile at that. Perhaps Sophia wasn't as influenced by her parents as I'd feared. "There's more you should know, Grandma," Kyle continued, his voice lower now. "Richard's business has been struggling. He made some bad investments last year. They're not in financial trouble exactly, but things are tighter than they let on. And the Montgomerys, they're having financial difficulties too." I finished for him. Kyle looked surprised. "How did you know?" "I did some research after all this started. I wanted to understand why this wedding needed to be so extravagant." "It's all for show," Kyle said bitterly. "Mr. Montgomery is trying to project success to attract new investors for their hotel chain, and Richard is using the wedding to strengthen business connections he desperately needs right now. Sophia and I are just props in their performance. My heart ached for him. What do you want Kyle forget about what everyone else expects? What would make you and Sophia happy? He was quiet for a long moment. We want to be married, we love each other, but all this pressure and pretense, it's making everything feel wrong. Sophia's been crying almost every night because her mother criticizes every decision she makes. The honeymoon they've planned is ridiculously lavish. We'd rather use that money for a down payment on a house. I reached across the table and took his hand. Then why go along with it? Because we didn't see a way out that wouldn't cause a huge family rift. Until now. He looked at me with a glimmer of hope. Grandma, when I heard what you did with the trust, part of me was relieved. It gives us leverage to make changes. What kind of changes? I asked. Sophia and I have been talking. We want to scale back the wedding to something that actually feels like us. Include the people who truly matter like you. Focus on our marriage, not on impressing business associates. I squeezed his hand. That sounds wonderful, Kyle, but won't her parents object? Probably, he admitted. But here's the thing. They can't afford the wedding they've planned without the trust money. They've already overextended themselves with deposits. If we present a unified front, they'll have to compromise. I considered this carefully. And what about your mother and Richard? Mum will follow Richard's lead, and Richard will do whatever preserves his business relationships. If the Montgomerys accept a scaled-back wedding, Richard will adjust. A plan was taking shape between us, unspoken but understood. Kyle would stand up for what he and Sophia truly wanted, and I would support them, not just emotionally, but financially in the right way. So, I said, finally, what would you like me to do? Kyle smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from him today. Would you come to dinner next weekend? Sophia wants to meet you properly, without her parents or mine present. We can talk more then about how to move forward. I felt tears prick my eyes. I'd love that, Kyle. As he was leaving, he hugged me tightly. I'm sorry, Grandma. I should never have let things get this far without checking in with you. You're here now, I said simply. That's what matters. After Kyle left, I sat in my kitchen feeling more hopeful than I had in weeks. This wasn't just about my invitation anymore. It was about helping Kyle and Sophia reclaim their wedding and start their marriage on their own terms. It was about standing for values over appearances, substance over show. I picked up the phone to call Martin. There were adjustments to the trust I wanted to discuss. Not to punish anyone, but to better support the young couple's actual needs, as George would have wanted. The next 3 weeks were a whirlwind of changes. After meeting Sophia for dinner, a lovely, intelligent young woman who seemed genuinely distressed by how I'd been treated, the three of us formulated a plan. Kyle and Sophia would announce modifications to their wedding plans, presenting them as mutual decisions focused on creating a more meaningful, intimate celebration. My role would be to reinstate the trust with specific conditions that supported their vision while preventing Richard and the Montgomerys from hijacking it again. I also received my formal invitation hand-delivered by Kyle with a personal note from Sophia expressing her hope that we could develop a close relationship. The announcement didn't go smoothly, of course. I wasn't present, but Kyle called me immediately after to report that Mrs. Montgomery had nearly fainted when they explained the reduced guest list and venue change. Richard had grown red-faced and pulled Kyle aside to lecture him about missed opportunities. Jessica had tearfully accused Sophia of turning Kyle against his family, but the young couple stood firm. The financial reality that the trust would only be released under these new conditions gave their decision weight that emotional appeals couldn't overcome. After 2 days of tense negotiations, a compromise was reached. The wedding would still be held at the Montgomery estate, but with half the original guest list. The extravagant 7-course dinner became a more reasonable reception. The designer floral arrangements were scaled back. Most importantly, the funds previously earmarked for their 3-week luxury honeymoon would instead go toward a down payment on a starter home with a modest 1-week trip to Maine substituted. When the day of the wedding arrived, I dressed carefully in a powder blue suit I'd bought specially for the occasion. I arrived early, unsure of my reception. A staff member led me to a seat near the back, far from the family section. My heart sank a little, but I reminded myself that at least I was included. The garden was beautifully decorated, if somewhat less ostentatious than I imagined the original plans had called for. The Montgomerys moved among their remaining guests with fixed smiles, while Richard worked the room, shaking hands with men in expensive suits. Jessica fluttered nervously between groups, her eyes occasionally darting to where I sat alone. Just before the ceremony was to begin, Kyle appeared at the altar. Instead of taking his position to wait for the bride, he asked for everyone's attention. "Before we begin, I want to make a small change," he announced, his voice strong and clear. "My grandmother Frances is seated in the back, but that's not where she belongs. Grandma, would you please come join our parents in the family section?" A murmur ran through the crowd as all eyes turned to me. For a moment, I sat frozen in surprise. Then, gathering my dignity, I stood and made my way to the front, where a chair had appeared beside Jessica. Richard's tight smile couldn't disguise his discomfort, but the Montgomerys were too concerned with their guests' reactions to object. "Thank you all for being here today," Kyle continued. "Sophia and I are grateful for everyone who has supported our relationship, but I want to especially thank my grandmother, whose wisdom and courage helped us remember what this day is really about. Not social connections or appearances, but love, family, and building a future based on genuine values." Jessica shifted uncomfortably beside me. I patted her hand gently, and after a moment's hesitation, she squeezed my fingers in return. The ceremony that followed was lovely in its simplicity. Sophia looked radiant as she walked down the aisle on her father's arm. The vows Kyle and Sophia had written themselves spoke of partnership, honesty, and staying true to each other through life's challenges. When they were pronounced husband and wife, the joy on their faces was unmistakably genuine. At the reception, I found myself approached by guests from both families. Sophia's aunt confided that she found the scaled-back celebration much more tasteful than the ostentatious display originally planned. One of Richard's business associates complimented me on raising such a principled grandson. Even Mrs. Montgomery, after several glasses of champagne, admitted that the smaller guest list had created a more exclusive atmosphere. The most surprising moment came when Sophia's father approached me during the dancing. "Mrs. Henderson," he said somewhat stiffly, "I believe we owe you an apology. There was a misunderstanding about the invitations." I smiled politely. "Water under the bridge now, Mr. Montgomery." He cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Yes, well, Sophia speaks very highly of you. She tells me you were a school principal for 30 years. Impressive dedication. Perhaps you could join us for dinner sometime after the young couple returns from their honeymoon. My wife would love to hear about your experiences in education." I doubted very much that Mrs. Montgomery had expressed any such interest, but I appreciated the olive branch. "That would be lovely." As the evening progressed, I noticed Jessica watching me interact with various guests. When the dinner ended and people moved to the dance floor, she finally approached me alone. "You've made quite an impression," she said, gesturing to where Mr. Montgomery was animatedly telling a story to a group that had previously been listening to me. "I'm just being myself, Jessica." She looked down at her hands. "I know. That's what makes it worse. You didn't have to put on airs or pretend to be something you're not. They're responding to your actual character." I waited, sensing she had more to say. "I'm sorry, Mum," she said, finally, her voice catching. I've lost sight of what matters. Watching you tonight, seeing how Kyle stands up for his values you taught him, not us. It's made me realize how much I've changed, and not for the better." I reached for her hand. "It's never too late to remember who you are, Jessica." Tears welled in her eyes. "Do you think we can start over somehow?" "We don't need to start over," I told her gently. We just need to move forward with more honesty. Family isn't about impressing people or maintaining appearances. It's about loving each other through the imperfect, messy reality of life. She nodded, wiping away a tear. Kyle told me about the trust, how you've restructured it to help them buy a house instead of funding that ridiculous honeymoon Richard and the Montgomerys planned. That was the right call. Thank you for saying so. Our conversation was interrupted when Kyle appeared asking me for a dance. As he led me to the floor for a slow song, I caught sight of Richard watching us, his expression unreadable. Richard will come around, Kyle said, following my gaze. He respects strength even when it frustrates him, and you've shown plenty of that, Grandma. I laughed softly. Not bad for an embarrassing old school principal, You were never embarrassing, Kyle said seriously. You were just real in a world full of pretense. I lost sight of how valuable that is, but I won't make that mistake again. 6 months after the wedding, my dining room table was filled with family for Sunday dinner, a new tradition we'd established. Kyle and Sophia sat side by side, still newlyweds, in the way they constantly found reasons to touch each other's hands or exchange private smiles. They'd moved into their new house just last month, a modest but charming starter home in a good neighbourhood made possible by the trust fund being used as intended. Jessica was there too, without Richard, who still found reasons to be busy when these family gatherings occurred. But that was progress of a sort. She was reclaiming her independence bit by bit. We were rebuilding our relationship slowly, finding our way back to the easy affection we'd once shared. Sophia's parents had come today as well, their third visit since the wedding. Mrs. Montgomery still seemed slightly uncomfortable in my home, but Mr. Montgomery had developed an unexpected appreciation for my straightforward nature. Refreshing, he called it, after years of navigating social circles where nothing was ever quite as it seemed. As I brought out apple pie for dessert, made from my mother's recipe that Kyle had always loved, I thought about how differently things might have turned out. If I hadn't stood my ground, if Kyle hadn't found the courage to assert his own vision for his wedding, if Sophia hadn't been the kind-hearted person she proved to be, we might all be living in separate worlds, now divided by pretense and resentment. Instead, here we were sharing food and conversation, building genuine connections. The trust fund that had nearly torn us apart had ultimately brought us closer together, not because of the money itself, but because of the values it represented. Later, after everyone had gone and I was washing the last of the dishes, I found myself thinking of George. He would have been proud of Kyle, I was certain, proud of how our grandson had ultimately chosen substance over show, integrity over appearance. And perhaps a little proud of me too for holding firm when it would have been easier to give in. The following weekend, Kyle and Sophia invited me to their new home for dinner. As we sat on their small back patio, watching the sunset, Sophia took my hand. "Francis," she said she still couldn't quite bring herself to call me Grandma. "Yet, Kyle and I have been talking. We want you to help us with something important." Kyle smiled. "We're creating a new trust fund, a small one for now, but someday when we have children, we want it to reflect the values you taught me. Would you help us write the terms?" I felt tears gather in my eyes. I'd be honoured. "We want our children to know what really matters," Sophia continued. "Not social climbing or impressing people, but integrity, compassion, and the courage to stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult. Especially when it's difficult," Kyle added. "That's the lesson I'll never forget from all of this. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to participate in something that betrays your values." As I drove home that evening, I reflected on the unexpected journey we'd all taken. What had begun as a painful exclusion had transformed into something valuable, a realignment of priorities, a recommitment to what truly matters in life. In standing up for my dignity, I'd helped Kyle and Sophia stand up for theirs. In refusing to fund a celebration I wasn't welcome at, I'd ultimately helped create something more genuine and meaningful, and in the process, fractured family relationships began to heal in ways I never anticipated. Life rarely gives us perfect solutions. Sometimes we have to make difficult choices, draw boundaries that others may not understand at first. But when those boundaries are rooted in genuine values rather than pettiness or revenge, they have the power to transform situations in surprising ways. I wonder if you've ever faced a similar situation in your family, a moment when standing firm was necessary even when it was painful. How did you handle it? Did it change your relationships in unexpected ways? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. And if you found value in my experience, please consider subscribing to this channel and sharing this video with someone who might need to hear that it's okay to expect respect even from family. Sometimes the most loving thing we can do for others is to love ourselves enough to say no when necessary. Thank you for listening to my story. May you find the courage to stand up for what matters in your own life and the wisdom to do it with love rather than bitterness. Until next time.